Bonjour et bienvenue. Welcome to the National Trust webinar on COVID-19, the heritage sector, and recommendations for recovery. This session today follows on two earlier calls, gatherings that we've held to bring together members of the heritage sector to talk about the issues that our sector is facing. And today we're going to be focusing on opportunities to play an important role in recovery for our country as we recover from the impacts of COVID-19. Just a note, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, feel free to send a note through the chat line and we'll deal with those issues. A note that if you are listening to us by telephone only, there was a presentation deck that was sent out earlier today, about an hour ago, unfortunately in English only, but we will follow up with the French version as soon as we can. And just a reminder that the recording of today's session will be shared with everyone, whether you're participating through the Zoom screen platform or on the telephone. And we'll also be sharing the chat and the Q&A record. On veut que cet appel est confortable pour les francophones et les anglophones, et on encourage des questions et les commentaires dans les deux langues officielles. Unfortunately, most of the conversation will probably be in English today, but we will increasingly have representation from Francophone voices in future calls. And we will feel free, as I said, de poser des questions et des commentaires en français. Nous avons des collègues ici qui sont prêts à répondre et à partager ces questions et ces commentaires en français et en anglais. Great, so welcome everyone. Just on the next slide, a few comments about the National Trust for Canada. We're a national registered charity. We care about places that matter and the people who care about those places. Information for reaching us or tweeting at us or tweeting about this session are there on the screen. I wanted to make a reference to our National Council. The National Trust works closely with a national network of provincial and territorial organizations that share our goals and our mandate. And we also have important national partners, the Indigenous Heritage Circle. We've been working closely with them, with Econos Canada, with the Canadian Urban Institute, the CMA. Last week, we hosted a call with the sector in partnership with the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. So those are just some of the organizations that we work with in our national role. Today, for this call, we have a number of panelists, and if we go to the next slide, you'll see their names and the organizations they're associated with. So I'm pleased to introduce Jane Severs, who is, among many other roles, a member of the Board of Governors of the National Trust for Canada, Ingrid Kazikoff from Heritage Saskatchewan, Paul Gravette from Heritage BC, Gil Barrows from Vox Public Affairs, Jerry Dick from the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador, and then from the National Trust staff team, Rob Peugeot, Chris Weeb, and myself. In a few comments about functionality for today's call, we encourage you to submit your questions and anything that you would like to be acknowledged during the course of this conversation here today using the Q&A function, and you should see that at the bottom of your screen. And encore une fois, en anglais ou en français. You can also use the chat function if you have information or comments you'd like to make that don't necessarily need to be acknowledged or considered by the panelists on the call today, but certainly all that information is important to us, and we'll be reviewing everything and sharing it all back out to everyone on the line following the call. On the next slide, you can just advance to the next slide. So just a link to resources, the work that the National Trust has been doing over the last few weeks in responding to the COVID situation and its impact on our sector. We've been sharing out information about the relief programs, and we won't get into those today, but if you do have questions, don't hesitate or check out our website. We've been sharing out virtual experiences of historic places, which we think is an important way to keep up awareness and keep the public engaged with these places during this challenging time of closures and lockdown. And then thinking about recovery as we're doing today, our work in government relations We have built strong relationships with government, and we're at a moment where we need to think about how we can work with governments to be part of recovery. Public awareness, we've talked about getting op-eds out there, something that all of us can do, and I think following this call, once we've agreed together what the sector's recommendations are, I think we're in a much stronger position to get some messaging out in various means, including through op-eds and social media. A reminder that we're holding these gatherings every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. And again, I think at this link you'll find information about how to sign up if you haven't already signed up for all of these calls, or to share the opportunity with your members and your colleagues. So today we're going to focus specifically on the sector's response and the opportunities that we want to raise to the attention of government as we all prepare for recovery. We put together a draft letter with recommendations that we shared out at the end of last week to all of our national council partner organizations and to some of our national partners. We've already received some comments, and we've adjusted the recommendations and added some new recommendations that will be on the screen today. So if you saw that draft letter but are finding some new information today, don't be surprised. And it's really about collectively deciding how we position ourselves, what our key recommendations are, and how we go forward to get that information out. So I will invite the panelists to jump in at any time. It's not a rigid structure for today's call. We're going to go through basically the key points in the letter section by section, and it's an opportunity for all of us to ask questions. There are big gaps that we need to fill in together as well. So why don't we move to, so I think, did we skip a slide, who we are? So the letter, we will talk a bit later about who the letter is addressed to, but I think it's useful for all of us to confirm the scope of our sector that we think we're trying to represent in putting this letter together. So that the draft letter actually identifies these groups: charities and nonprofits, historic destinations, Indigenous cultural landscapes, places of faith. In summary, what we call Canada's cultural and social infrastructure. But it's also the owners and stewards of all existing and older buildings in urban and rural communities and in traditional downtowns. And then again, looking at both the people and the places, the third bullet, professionals, tradespeople, and suppliers who specialize in renewing and adapting existing older and heritage structures. So basically we're saying that this is the group of people and places that we are talking about when we talk about the historic places sector. So any comments or additions to that? Is there anything that we've missed? Anything the panelists would like to add, or that those commenting through the Q&A or the chat would like to add? Great. Hearing nothing, maybe we'll move on, but feel free if something comes to you to add that on as we continue. And then what we offer. On the next slide, Jerry Dick, who's one of our panelists today, sent a note saying we should really upfront in this letter be clear about the opportunity that our sector has to be an important part of recovery, and how what we are offering really stands out from what other organizations might be offering. For example, the new construction industry or the green construction industry. I think we agree we really have a leg up in terms of the fact that the projects we could offer up, the shovel-ready projects, are employment intensive, that they can attract new private investment, our connection to climate action, and the importance of these places for social cohesion and local pride. And then that last point, what we're recommending doesn't have the negative environmental impact that new construction would have. So we can put better words around that, but I'm just wondering if anyone has any comments about any aspect of what we offer that needs to be added to this content.
Jerry here. My thinking, so Jerry Dick, Heritage NL. My thinking was that probably government's getting a lot of letters from a lot of sectors. So I think upfront to really emphasize why heritage, why now, is important right up front. And I think that we can make a very strong case for that in this instance in terms of part of the whole post-COVID economic renewal.
Great, thanks, Jerry. And I saw a chat comment zip through about the tourism piece is also should be mentioned up front in what we offer. The strong role the places we care about play in tourism.
Natalie, it's Chris Weed here from the National Trust. Good point there that in that list of who's part of our sector, that academics and students and people in the heritage education sector should also be included. Quick question, a quick comment, just to throw it out there for people. We have some solid data around job creation and the differences between new construction and rehabilitation, and then kind of the labor intensity of both. If others have some, please get a hold of me, and I'd be happy to. It would be great to help strengthen the data that we already have. So get in contact with me about that.
Great, thanks everyone. Why don't we move ahead to the next slide? And so before we get into the actual recommendations and how we're approaching, how we suggest to approach this message to the federal government, I'd like to turn it over to Gil Barrows, who is here on the screen and joining us by phone. So we're hoping for good sound quality. But Gil Barrows has been an important advisor for the National Trust and for our National Council organizations over the years, and we're relying on him more than ever these days. Gil.
Thank you, Natalie. How is the sound quality? Can folks hear me?
It sounds good for me.
Okay. Well, if it's bad, tell me and I'll speak louder. So can we advance then to the next slide? I don't think that's it. These are the ministers that National Trust is proposing to target. I don't think that's what I'm supposed to be. I don't know, Natalie. Did we get a slide for my comments?
Sorry, Gil. No, there should just be an introductory slide for you. So you're.
Oh, okay.
You're on your own.
You can go back. You can go back.
Sorry.
Well, no problem at all. I guess if there's three things that I hope you can take away from my brief comments here is that the environment's moving very fast in Ottawa. There is huge competition for money. Everyone and their dog is lined up and saying, help us. And the final point is that I hope we can count on people. I said we got over 100 people participating here. I hope we can count on people out in the field and not just your National Trust staff in Ottawa to carry the load here. So my first point, I think, is the government is like moving in warp drive. I've never seen them moving so fast. I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues was working for a company that wanted to bring a hand sanitizer onto the market. It needs approval. He sent an email on a Friday. On Friday evening, he got a response from the manager involved. Saturday afternoon, he got a comment, another email back from the fellow at the working level to say this is how you go about it. Sunday, he got some specific instructions on how to get this hand sanitizer approved. I mean, normally that would take perhaps months. So the government's moving very fast. I think the other thing to think about is immediacy in producing results is important. If you're going to make an argument for funding for the heritage sector, it has to be actionable right away. Those are the things that the government is going to be talking about. When we hear the Minister of Infrastructure speaking, Catherine McKenna is saying, shovel ready, shovel ready. So the quickest you can get down to proposing something that can be implemented right away, the better. There's third point, there's huge competition. Everybody's looking for money from the federal government, and I think you have to face the fact that heritage may not be on the top of the agenda. You've probably seen comments about, for instance, there's a meatpacking plant in Alberta that has been shut down, huge job losses, and more importantly, it is the town of High River, where it's located, is now being inundated with the COVID-19 infection. So that will probably be a bigger priority for funding than the heritage sector. So we just have to face that. We think that the government is going to prioritize things. The key points of influence, I think, for the heritage sector are obviously the Prime Minister's office and the Minister's offices, which are going to be outlined later in this presentation. But also keep in mind that the House of Commons Finance Committee is meeting virtually once or twice a week, and they are talking about the government's response to COVID. And some of their priorities are tourism, which somebody just mentioned, tourism, hospitality, Indigenous issues, and small and medium-sized businesses. So think if you can couch that gives you a way to couch your comments to the government. And final comment I'll make is that, don't forget the politics of this. Everybody in government is thinking, okay, number one, health, number two, employment and economics. But they're also in the back of their mind, they're thinking about the next election, positioning themselves. So don't forget that. We will see the Conservatives are, being very critical of how the government is acting and how they're spending money. Keep the Liberals, well, they're going to look on things that, initiatives that really segue well with their, first, to produce quick results, as I said, but second, their overall agenda. For instance, they've got a heavy political investment in environmental issues, and they also have a heavy investment in Indigenous issues. And the final point I will make is that, again, I hope that out of these hundreds of people who are participating in these calls, we can, the National Trust at headquarters here can help you to get a hold of your members of Parliament and get a message to them. That'll be almost as important as what the National Trust staff can do. And with that, I will conclude or take messages as you like, take questions as you like, Natalie.
Great, thank you very much, Gil. And maybe I'll just say that we've already sent out this draft letter with a call to our partners to endorse it, so that we're all signing the same message and singing from the same songbook, and many organizations have already weighed in with their willingness to do that. We may want to think about getting some key developers and other champions to support these asks. So let's think about that as we go through the various pieces of these recommendations. But are there any immediate questions or comments, Rob or Chris, that you might want to address before we start drilling down into the recommendations?
Natalie, there's an interesting question from Doug Evans here. He says, a simple way to achieve fast results for heritage might derive from a survey on heritage at risk. Team of heritage people recording the current state of affairs. I'm wondering, just riffing off of that and flipping it into a more kind of a positive kind of aspect. I'm wondering if it comes back to what you were talking about, Natalie, about the shovel-ready heritage projects that could really, that we could bring to government to show that there's a whole kind of there's a stable of places that can have, where we can have meaningful impact, create jobs, and also have that kind of community impact. Do you have some comments?
Yeah, no, well, I think we definitely, like, as we go through the letter, it would be great to have some high profile, compelling examples of places that could benefit from this funding, to make it more real, as opposed to just talking about investment in certain kinds of places. So that's certainly something, like, crowdsourcing that list together and on social media be tweeting at the various ministers about places that would benefit from this funding is one idea, I think, for our follow-up.
So I have a question.
Yes.
And it's directed at Gil, but it's at everyone, and that's given the fact that there is unfortunately a lot of asks going out there, that as much as I appreciate all of the points that are in the letter, and I think that they're really great points, when we start asking for this ask, would we be better served to make a few short points and then indicate, and it's something that from my own experience in Saskatchewan working with the nonprofit a partnership, that we really need to emphasize that the nonprofits, or all of us, or somebody representing us, needs to be at the table going forward when the decisions are made, because small business and medium-sized business have been included at the table, the public sector, but the rest of us haven't really been to any great extent. And I'm just wondering if that's something going forward that we have to keep in mind, so that we work in partnership with government, but that we be at the table to help strengthen some of the arguments that we're wanting to make going forward, rather than putting them all in the letter at the same time. Because my question is, and it's just a question I'm asking, if we put too much in the letter, who's going to be reading it in detail in the midst of all these other asks that are coming together?
Gil, do you want to respond to that?
It's a good point, and I thought about it as you're reading the letter. I think what you're trying to accomplish with the letter is lay down a marker with a lot of signatures on it, which is good. But you immediately have to follow up with individual ministers' offices. Otherwise, Ingrid's right. It's just this long letter, and it doesn't. We'll get back to you in a month. So, and to make the contact with the minister's office real, like the idea of, like, do we have a specific shovel-ready project? Do we have something that is tangible that we can demonstrate to the government that this will work? So I think it's a good point. I think 2 steps: send a letter and demonstrate broad support, and then drill down right away, like within days.
Great. Thanks, Gil. Why don't we jump to the next slide? And this is part of the complexity for our sector, that in the past we would have just written to the Minister of the Environment, but I think we're waking up to the fact that what we have to offer as a sector is really of interest to at least 4 ministries: Environment and Climate Change, Canadian Heritage, Infrastructure and Communities, and Melanie Joly, who is Tourism and Economic Development. Tourism falls under her portfolio. So the idea is that we would write this letter to all 4, and we open by saying you all have something to gain from understanding what our sector can offer. And so again, maybe any comments on that? There are lots of footnotes in the letter, and it might be possible for us to pull the footnotes to the end, but then maybe write something that is more specific to each of these ministers' area of interest. Just a question.
Jerry here. I'm thinking, if the focus is on shovel ready, should that not be the primary focus of our comments? That heritage projects are good shovel ready projects for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think then there's the other side of that, because we've heard recently that ACOA, for example, has doubled their amount of funding. We're also hearing that they're perhaps going to drop the for not-for-profit groups, the applicant portion of funding required, their matching portion. So this is all really good news. So the other piece of work that I think we need to do is getting messaging out to our clients and community groups and whatnot that we work with, is there's going to be money. You need to be, now is your time to get those applications in. So kind of taking advantage of what we know is going to be there.
Right. Any other comments before we leave this slide?
Natalie, just hi, Rob Pageau here, just jumping in from the National Trust. A couple comments in the chat box that sort of agreeing with that approach that you were raising, Ingrid, of keeping this initial letter very simple, but getting it out very quickly. Perhaps not getting into all the level of detail of all the potential impacts, but getting something, it's probably more important to get something out to the Prime Minister with CC to a couple ministers, but getting it out quickly. So that some comments supporting that idea.
Okay, so why don't we move on to the next? So now we're getting into the actual recommendations. So the first one, and there's a big blank there. So invest, and maybe we don't need to include a dollar figure. I'd be interested in Gil and others' perspective on that. But so invest in recovery measures that help restore social and cultural infrastructure, fuel future tourism, and engage Canadians.
It's Gil here. I think you should put a figure in there, and I think it should be big. And I think you should put jobs in here. You know, maybe right behind recovery measures and employment, because that's. I hate to say this, but the government is much more interested in jobs than in heritage, and you know, we need to jump on that.
Yeah. No, and I think, Gil, your comment about heritage not being on the top of the agenda, it's important for us not to lead with the H word, that this is really about opportunities for stimulus and creation of jobs. Paul Gravett, you've done a lot of work with translating investments into GDP and jobs. Can you help us with multipliers to translate a dollar figure into projected numbers of jobs? Or are others on the line do that?
Possibly. We certainly have data, the multipliers. I think the multipliers are specific to BC, but we could do some research and see what else we can find. And certainly the methodology we've worked out.
Okay, sounds good. And maybe we don't have to debate the dollar figure here, but anyone with opinions, Gil, I don't know, like are we unfortunately, I don't think can base that number on a specific numbers of places that could partake of this. That's one of our challenges.
Well, you could say, you know, cap it at 200 million or something like that. You know, there are projects out there that you know, we're willing to assess, and if you could give some examples, that would be great. Then make it clear that it's a capped fund.
So let's skip through. There's a bit more information about this ask. So this first recommendation for this dollar amount is, in our mind at least, is focused on the charitable sector. So historic sites, museums, cultural hubs, places of faith, Indigenous heritage places. So these are not commercial. They're not the buildings on Main Street. They're part of the cultural and social infrastructure. And on this slide here, some words about what that funding could be used for. And so I'm just pointing this out to distinguish from the second, a later recommendation, which is really more about all those other buildings. So residential, commercial, the buildings on Main Street, properties where there would be private investment that could be leveraged. So I just want to make sure that we're all okay with this sort of two-part ask. And so if we say 100 million or 200 million for this, we're looking at a separate pot of money for the second ask. So let's just, we may want to talk about that, but let's skip ahead to the next slide, which talks a bit more about this first recommendation. So suggesting that the money can flow through existing mechanisms, like ACOA was mentioned earlier, regional economic development agencies, the Cultural Spaces Canada program, or the National Cost Sharing Program. We know that it's probably easier for governments to absorb something like this into pre-existing mechanisms, as opposed to coming up with some brand new idea that needs to be completely thought through. So it helps them see an easy way to respond to this ask. And then the second bullet, I think this is the last bullet about that first recommendation, a question. We've talked about, I think, Jared, you mentioned there's already been some relaxing of the matching requirements for some of those funds, not all of them, but we may want to be careful about how we say this. So any comments or questions about that or any part of this first recommendation? Ingrid.
I'm just wondering, and I'm just asking this of everyone, that to me, these might be some of the pieces that could be the more, the detail rather than what has to go right out in the,
Okay.
yeah, like the recommendation that the funding could flow through existing mechanisms to me is more detail than you might need in that first letter. That could go to the ministers or could be some of the solutions. I'm just looking for a way to condense the letter. These are great ideas, but to me, some of these are getting maybe more into some of the finer detail.
Yes.
Just a point I'm making.
Okay.
I'm not sure if anyone else thinks that way, but
okay. I saw Jane shaking her head.
I think that government is always interested in opportunities to simplify process. So if there are existing programs, it's much easier for them to allocate funding into existing programs than to create and have a brand new funding program approved. So even if we don't list every existing program available, I think just recognizing the fact that programs exist, that they can enhance rather than invent, is important thing for bureaucrats.
well, it's fine. It's fine to keep it that way as long as we don't get into too much detail. Is more what I'm. Yeah.
No, we hear you there, but we might want to take something away. But I'm just thinking, mentioning an example like maybe this isn't a follow-up document, but the Woodland Cultural Center, an Indigenous heritage place that is looking for $10 million for a roofing project. To point to some of those things that are government priorities, Indigenous places, for example, might be a smart thing to do.
Absolutely.
So anything else before we move off this recommendation?
Jane here from Newfoundland and Labrador. I think that the second point about matching funds, I'm not sure if it should go in this letter, but it's critical. Heritage organizations have also always had a tough time coming up with matching funds for capital projects because you're often talking about a significant amount of money, and it's going to be even more difficult for them to come up with it now. So, it's going to be vital. And here in Newfoundland, anything from the Regional Diversification Fund or Regional Development Agency, ACOA, they not only they provide their amount, but it has to be matched by a contribution from the province. And Newfoundland, there is no provincial money to provide matching funds right now. So what my fear is that the feds will come up with this big pot of money, but it'll be left on the table because nobody will be able to come up with matching funds.
No, it's an important point. So
actually, Chris, sorry, Natalie, Chris just jumping in here. Dale Stanley, I can't see the full name there, sorry. Dale anyway mentioned in the chat about student employment and YCW funding and the need to maybe remove the matching fund component from that as well, and ask for that to ensure that student employment happens, because it'll be a similar situation where organizations just don't have the matching funds for the other 50% of a student's time.
And I know that requirement to match has already been removed from the Canada Summer Jobs program. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see something similar for Young Canada Works. Okay, anything else specifically about that first recommendation? Maybe we'll move along. I see the time is ticking. So next slide. So recommendation 2. So as I set up earlier, this idea of a fund for cultural and social infrastructure, and then a second pot for the working title Greening Existing Buildings Fund, 100 million. So it could, maybe that's not the right number. So it could either be brand new money or this sort of draft note and or earmark that funds that money within existing infrastructure and economic development funds. So we may want to decide what's the best way to present that to stimulate private sector investment and help Canadian property owners take important steps toward a low carbon economy. So the kinds of places we see benefiting from that fund, the buildings on Main Street, potentially residential properties, industrial places. Any discussion about that idea and the dollar value that we might want to put there? Is it okay to say a new fund or earmark funds within existing programs? Are we comfortable with that? What's our savviest approach? Gil, any thoughts from you? Oh.
Natalie, I'm just going to jump in while we're waiting for Gil. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity there to put a couple of things together with money for Main Street, those Main Street buildings, but also around affordable creating housing above, quickly creating housing above on the second and third floors of a lot of those kind of traditional main streets. Maybe there's an opportunity to yoke a number of things together there.
Any other thoughts or comments about that? Would it be smarter just to talk about one fund and that is eligible for both charitable, social infrastructure, and also for private, or is it smarter to keep them separate? There may not be a right answer.
I have to wonder if 2 requests is one too many. We've heard comments already about too much information in the letter. Two requests could mean one is chosen and another is dropped.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have to ask, will people understand what the difference is between the 2 requests?
Yes.
We might understand, but people in the minister's offices, will they understand?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's very doable to roll those 2 ideas into one. If I'm seeing nodding heads, any reason not to do that? And Gil, are you hearing and able to weigh in?
Yeah, I can hear. I agree. Simplify it. It's almost academic at this point until we get into the minister's offices and into the bureaucracy to see what their reaction is to the letter.
Right. Okay. Good feedback. Anything, Chris or Rob, coming in through the Q&A to raise at this point?
It's Rob here. There's lots of a very fulsome discussion happening in the chat box. There's tons of stuff, great discussion happening there as well, Natalie, in parallel. They're not specifically to this recommendation though. So at one point, maybe we can come back to some great points that are being raised. But if you want to get through your last recommendation, maybe we can spend some time on some of the other themes that are coming out.
Okay. So the original letter basically just had those 2 recommendations. There was a 3rd recommendation that isn't really a recommendation, but that talked about doing no harm, making sure that all the infrastructure money that flows isn't used, as we saw it almost used in 2008 to tear down heritage buildings for new development, for example. But in the comments that came through from the National Trust Board and from National Council members and others, there are a couple more ideas that I wanted to put in front of us today to discuss. So on the next slide, hopefully. So potentially a 3rd idea, but I'm already hearing our desire to keep this tight and reduce the number of asks. But there was a suggestion that we should be doing something specifically for traditional downtowns. And I know that coming out of the Environment Committee hearings and the report 10 that was published, I guess a couple of years ago now, the Main Street Canada idea did come up as a recommendation that would be beneficial and maybe more particularly for rural areas than for urban. But I guess my question, we don't know really what this looks like yet, and my question is whether the stimulus funding that we're asking for would address the needs of heritage buildings on Main Street and their owners, but whether there's something bigger for the businesses, like the legacy businesses, and protecting the ability of businesses downtown to survive, that's a question. We actually have a phone conversation later this afternoon with the Canadian Urban Institute, and they're looking carefully at whether there is a particular ask for Main Street. So welcome any comments here today, and we can keep thinking about this on our own as well.
Jerry Dick here from Heritage NL. I've been thinking about this, particularly as it relates to downtown St. John's, and I wonder if there's a role for the National Trust in maybe not the full meal deal in terms of Main Street, but some of those aspects around animation, because downtown community businesses are really hurting, and they need, they don't necessarily need the bricks and mortar right now, but they need that help with how can we get more people down here? How can we animate? So I'm wondering if there's something there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, Jerry. And maybe it's as much about awareness and driving people to go to traditional centers and historic places.
And I saw a really good site that was 100 ideas or something like that for animating downtown. So I wonder, you know, maybe we could put together just a list of ideas or things that downtowns can do in terms of that post-COVID animation process.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. So any other comments about 3? I see some notes coming in the chat. Rob, or Chris, anything you want to raise before we move on?
I think Graham brought up an interesting, and Dinu Bumbaru brought up a good points there around sending a first ask fast is important, writes Graham, perfect and coordinated after. So I guess it's just reiterating some of the things that Paul and others are saying. Keep your message tight, and rather than asking for too many things and not hitting with any of them.
And I think one of the other themes that has been coming through on the chat, sorry, it's Rob Pajot here again, is the need for collaboration, especially at this time for immediate response. There are others in the sector that are doing great work in terms of advocacy, and I think we realize that we'll be supporting other measures that will meet immediate needs for employment, et cetera, and the rent alleviation for businesses in the Main Street context. But perhaps the longer term ask and for recovery is where the focus is where we should be putting our focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the original version of the letter said we support, in terms of relief measures, we support what other, like the CMA and Imagine Canada and others are putting out there to government. But we may just pull that out altogether to avoid muddying the water and focus on the recommendations we're making around recovery. So recommendation 3. So why don't we jump ahead to, I think it's the last piece, recommendation 4. So again, this is something new that came in as a suggestion that we encourage the federal government to invest directly in its own portfolio of properties. So we know properties across the country that have deferred maintenance. I think of all those lighthouses that the federal government would love to deaccession that it still owns. And even if there is a real focus on disposal of property out of the federal portfolio, potentially encouraging government to make those projects happen sooner rather than later could be useful. So, but again, not wanting to water down what we're asking for. Any thoughts on this concept?
Jane here, Natalie. I think that the word on the street, at least within Atlantic Canada, is that if funding comes, it's going to be in the form of a community infrastructure fund, kind of similar to the Canada 150 fund, where any kind of community infrastructure, so it might be the local arena or community center or a heritage structure. And so if that seems to be the way things are going, then couldn't we just ask government to remember heritage when it comes time for community infrastructure funding? because to me that would kind of encompass everything that we've touched on here. And in terms of being proactive, what some groups here in Newfoundland have been doing is that they've already been communicating with their municipalities to get heritage projects on the towns or the cities short list of priority projects should infrastructure funding come. And then, yeah, so then that way you don't have competing applications coming from one jurisdiction.
So Jane, are you saying, is that a message that goes with this, with the ask, or is it, what are you suggesting?
I mean, I think that the second part about being proactive and partnering with your municipality or whatever your jurisdiction is, that's something that heritage organizations can do themselves. But I think in terms of the ask, I'm a bit of a pessimist. I really can't see government specifically targeting the heritage sector for a huge amount of funding. I can see them quite, I think there's a very good chance that they will develop a community infrastructure fund. So I think that we should be acknowledging that, but asking government and meantime asking everybody else within our circles to remember heritage as critical parts of community infrastructure. And what can we do at our level to make sure that people are doing that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's more encouraging government to go ahead with a community infrastructure fund and then making sure that heritage is part of that.
Right.
Jerry Dick here. I would very much agree with that. I think, there are going to be a lot of existing programs. And, if we look back at we had a massive post-moratorium economic adjustment program. We probably have very little to show for that. So I think heritage, you can really make a strong case that it's a long-term strategy for communities in terms of economic revitalization. So again, I would emphasize on getting some of those messages out about heritage. You're going to be investing in projects, invest in heritage projects for these reasons.
Is that essentially what we're saying with we're going to roll our first two asks into one and talk about delivering that through existing mechanisms? Is that what we're doing, do you think? Or is this a separate?
Well, I wonder if initially that shouldn't be the focus, because we know that's all moving very quickly. And then if we want some additional new programs or whatever, maybe that is a little bit of a follows up after, I don't know.
Gil, any thoughts from you on that? Gil Barrows? Oh, we can't hear you. Oops. Are you, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure I quite follow this, and maybe that's a sign that it's just too complicated. Or maybe it's just that I haven't been listening carefully enough. But I like the idea of shovel ready quickly, and jobs are the big focus here. And again, I'll hate to say it, but heritage is not the big focus for the government. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Well, because I think I'm not sure I understand either. I think fundamentally we're asking for, like, we are saying, don't forget these existing buildings and the social and buildings that are part of the social and cultural infrastructure when this infrastructure money flows. So is that enough, or are we saying we think government needs to earmark chunks of funding specific to those kinds of places because they are often overlooked in infrastructure programs?
My view is we're going to have to get into the departments, to senior managers, and into ministers' offices to find out mostly what they're interested in. I don't understand, the framework for how these decisions are being taken within government, and I think that's probably the number one thing we need to figure out. So a lot of this is fine. It doesn't really matter a whole lot until we figure out what the government is thinking and how we can dovetail into that.
Good. Ingrid.
But what I'm also hearing, I think I've heard from Jane and Jerry too, and this is something that I would echo in Saskatchewan and would make a case for me too going forward, even provincially, is that when money starts to roll out, it's going to go to community somehow, whether that's municipalities, whatever, and that we're wanting to send a strong message. Don't forget that heritage is part of that community, because I think when it comes to infrastructure and whatever, when it boils down to community, we want to see that we're eligible for that funding as well. And I think that's something that I certainly can echo here in Saskatchewan is likely how some of that's going to get rolled out. So just wanted to make that point.
Paul.
I would like to support that. I think what Jane is saying, there's a much larger picture, and we're part of that bigger picture. And we've already heard on the call a few times that heritage is not the government's priority, but in that larger picture, we are a priority, and we need to play on that.
Great. No, that's really good feedback. So we can just skip by the next slide. I think it started out as a recommendation, but I think it's just a message to government that gets rolled into our bigger messaging that we've seen too many cases of infrastructure funding that do something negative for historic places and for traditional downtowns. So we're really proactively encouraging government to do really positive to get the biggest bang for those investments by investing in places that are part of the cultural and social infrastructure and that will move us toward a low carbon economy. So just some time, a little bit of time left for just some open discussion. One item I was hoping Paul Gravett would address, he'd raised the idea of how to align an ask to the federal government with what is being requested at the provincial level. So any thoughts about that? Starting with you, Paul, and then it would be great to hear from others about whether they have already submitted or seen submissions coming from the heritage sector to provincial and territorial governments.
Thanks, Natalie. Of course, we have been thinking about this, an approach to the provincial government, and we have precedents with the Canada BC 150 grant fund, which did move money out to communities for infrastructure development. We heard Ingrid reference this already, so I'm sure this is being considered across the country. I would like to put forward that we support the trust in developing language and a strong request, and then I and maybe Ingrid and others use the same or similar language with the trust's support and with, say, Heritage Saskatchewan support when I go to the BC government, and show that there's a solidarity across the country and that the federal government is being asked and all provincial governments are being asked.
Jerry Dick here. We're kind of operating on the assumption here in Newfoundland and Labrador that the provincial government is extremely stressed fiscally, and so that we're pretty sure there are not going to be new dollars. So we're really relying heavily on the federal government. Although we have been trying to get messaging to the province that they still do have some funding programs, so that what exists, they give serious attention to heritage.
Yeah, and Jane here, I'll just add, oops. I'll just add to what Jerry said, in that ACOA has been, the feds here in Newfoundland have been really proactive in contacting the major heritage organizations directly and asking for data to document economic hardship and cash flow problems. So they are very much putting together an ask for community heritage organizations in the province.
Any other comments from the provincial perspective? Anything coming in on the chat? Oops. So maybe I will, again, wrapping up the conversation. I think we started early on with a comment about creating a list of at-risk properties, and then we segued from that to talk about how do we get lots of information together about potential shovel-ready projects? How could we crowdsource that information together? Because I know for us at the national level, one of the challenges is to make our asks real with being able to point to examples, especially in the ridings of key cabinet ministers. So that's certainly something we can use your help with, and maybe that's a follow-up email that we can send out. But any comments or thoughts about that and other follow-up strategies? Gil, you got into follow-up a little bit in your remarks. Did you want to say anything further at this point? Oh, we can't hear you. Gil?
No, I'm fine,
Okay.
thanks.
Great. So as I said earlier, we'll be continuing these conversations every 2 weeks, but I think our letter, my preference would be to get that letter wrapped up and out the door tomorrow at the latest. So we encourage all of you to, if you have any further thoughts or comments, to let us know. If you're willing to trust us and just endorse and let us use your logo on the letter, that would be great. I think having as much that show of solidarity right up front would really be a strong move for us. So
Natalie, it's Gil. Just one thing, I just saw a comment come in from somebody, and I've lost it now, that Heritage Montreal has already written to the federal minister. Gotta find it here. But the point is coordination here. That, you know, if they've done it, they're on the ball, but we've got to make sure that the messages that are going to ministers are as coordinated as possible.
Just to be clear, that was to the Quebec, the provincial ministry, Gil, that they sent that letter. But that's a good point. If anybody, sorry, Robert Pajot again here, if any heritage organization has already sent letters, just let us know, either at the provincial, or I don't think anybody sent anything at the federal level, but if any provincial letters have been sent, or even at the municipal level, I think it would be useful for us to see that language and what people are saying. So if you could forward that to either Natalie, Chris, or myself at the National Trust.
okay, sounds good. And we will share our letter out. Just to be clear, we normally work with the national council organizations, the provincial territorial organizations, and we rely on our provincial partners to tell us what they're hearing from within their own parts of the country. But we will share our letter. We'll get it out. I'm not sure if we'll do a newsletter this week, but we will get it out to a broader audience and encourage others to mirror that language and to meet with their MPs. Like I think that follow-up work is the next wave of getting us getting meetings and individuals promoting these concepts more broadly. So stay tuned. We'll be talking more about follow-up strategies in future calls. Again, every other Tuesday at 12:15. You can register for them all in one go, or you can pick and choose the ones that you want to participate in. We're always looking for panelists as well. It's important to hear voices and see faces on the screen. So get in touch if you would be willing to participate representing your organization or interest in a future call. So I think that's everything for today. Merci beaucoup. We will share out the recording and also the deck in French and English. Apologies for being tardy getting that together, but we'll do a better job in future calls. Merci beaucoup. À la prochaine.